Was over the last 10 or 15 years. So in 15 years, I've probably spoken to this club maybe 6 times. So it's a nice club. I enjoy coming here. And somebody mentioned that I was just at the Georgia meeting speaking. I wasn't supposed to do that. Jennifer Berry was supposed to be the speaker, and so I kind of filled in at the last minute. And I borrowed this talk. I'm going to start off by telling you why we make nukes. As a commercial beekeeper, there's something that's very important to us, and that is diversification of income. That would be the first reason. It's not many commercial outfits that have the wherewithal to weather a bad honey year. Most commercial outfits do something besides just produce honey. Producing bees is one, pollination is one, creating retail sales, honey sales is another. We have 3 or 4 things going on, but one of them is producing bees to sell. We produce packages and nukes. This year we're producing twice as many nukes as we are packages, and there's a couple reasons we do that. Probably the main reason we like to make nukes over packages is that when you make a nuke, you are automatically rotating comb out. And to us, that's a pretty big deal. When you sit down with a pencil and a calculator, it would seem that making packages is more lucrative than making nukes as a commercial outfit. But when you incorporate that comb rotation into the equation, it kind of changes things. A lot of beekeepers pride themselves on using combs that their daddy used. Have you heard that? Oh yeah, my dad used those. And they seem to be proud of it. Well, 70 years ago, when there wasn't many pesticides and all the stuff out in the world that there is today, that was probably okay. But comb is if you look at beeswax under a microscope, it's really not a solid. If you look at it under a very powerful microscope, it almost looks like a sponge. It's porous. And it absorbs things like fungal spores, heavy metals, pesticides, a lot of stuff actually. And what we want to get rid of, all of us should make a choice to do this, is to get rid of the old, dark, heavy, black comb. Now, we don't put those in our nukes and sell them. What we try to do is replace our comb often enough to where we never have those heavy, dark, black combs. And we really have almost none now, and it's because we make nukes every year. When you make a nuke, if you have a double deep colony and you make a 5-frame nuke, you've just cycled out 25% of your comb. In a 3-year field study by Jennifer Berry at the University of Georgia, she studied the effects of raising brood in new comb versus old heavy black comb. And she found some interesting things. She found out that when bees rear brood in new comb, they rear more brood than they do when their colony is all black, dark comb. They also found that the brood that was there had a higher percentage of hatch. In other words, more of the larvae that were in that comb hatched. And on top of that, they found that the bees that hatched were as much as 19% lighter in body weight when they were reared in old dark comb. So to put that whole thing in a nutshell, it means that if you have a colony that's full of old dark black comb, you're rearing less bees and you're rearing smaller bees. And it's as simple as that. So in her study, she showed that within 2 or 3 years, you want to, if you can, cycle your old comb out and put in new comb. Now, for most of us, that's not real practical. And from a commercial point of view, it's definitely not practical. If you rotate every single comb every 3 years, you're spending a lot of money and time and labor doing it. So the first question that arises is, where's the point of diminishing returns there? At what point should you replace a comb? And I don't have an exact answer for that. I have kind of a hunch from watching the colonies and doing this for 4 decades. I think that combs should be gone by 8 or 10 or 12 years. Somewhere between 8 and 12 years, they need to be gone. After 8 to 10 years, they start to get that heavy feel. You know, that's from all some of the weight is from some of the silk cocoon that's left over and the feces that's left over when a bee emerges. The bees, of course, try to clean that out, but they don't get it all. The cells are constantly shrinking and the walls are getting thicker. And I think about 8 to 10 years, you need to be getting that comb out of there. Now, if you're making nukes and cycling out 25% of your comb every year, you're beating that. Comb's expensive. You know, the bees, I've read, and I guess it's true. If you read it, it must be true, right? That it takes 8 pounds of honey to make a pound of wax. So the bees have quite an investment in that comb. So cycling it out every 3 years is not only expensive for us, but it's expensive for the bees too. That's how I came up with this guess at 8, 10, maybe 12 years at the most. I had a friend in Florida who had inherited his outfit from his dad. He was a second-generation beekeeper. And he had many old combs from when his dad was alive. And about 2 years ago, he was having a real hard time keeping his bees alive. And he suspected that the comb was the problem, so he sent off some of his comb to a lab in Florida and asked, you know, for an analysis to come back. And the person that was doing the testing called him on the phone and said, "You don't need an analysis. I'm going to tell you right now that nothing can survive in this comb. That's all you need to know." Some of this comb was 20 or 30 years old, of course. Now, it's not just the wax absorbing these things. Wood is quite porous too. So you like to think, well, I'll just take the old comb out, the old foundation, and put in a fresh sheet of foundation. Not sure that's a good answer either. You need to get rid of the whole thing. And I want to go back and say, I'm not advocating selling your old dark combs in nukes. That's not what we're about. We're about this constant cycling so our combs don't get that old. When you buy a nuke from us, you'll see some things that look, you know, 3, 4, 5 years old, and that's just part of it. And that's part of the attraction for me, is cycling that older stuff out. When we're making nukes and the crew gets set up, the first thing I tell them is I say, pick the darkest ones first. And I say, we're not looking for the junk. If it's a junk comb, throw it out. But we want the older ones to go in the nukes first, so we're constantly cycling this comb. Does that make sense? Yeah, big deal to us. It's a big deal to me. The third reason for making nukes is swarm control and equalization. For new beekeepers, I saw a raise of hands earlier. How many new beekeepers are here again? Okay, here's a fact that you need to remember. This is of paramount importance in your beekeeping, as important as anything. If a colony peaks in population before the honey flow starts, the main honey flow, which in this neighborhood would be blackberries, tulip poplar, things like that. If your colony peaks in population before that honey flow starts, the odds are very high that it's just going to swarm on you, no matter what you do. If it peaks after the honey flow starts, the odds go way down. And you can take that basic information and work it in many ways. You can trick the bees into not swarming with that information alone. We do that. What we do is I know that a colony that starts off in the early spring with 4 frames of bees will peak in population in 7 to 8 weeks. And of course, the closer it gets to the honey flow, the larger it can be, but not too large, if I'm saying that right. So we, through making nukes, try to depopulate a colony to the point where we feel it will peak just after the honey flow starts. If it was 8 weeks out, we might feel comfortable with 3 frames of bees in brood. If it's 4 weeks out, we might feel comfortable with 5 or 6 or 7. Every place has different conditions and different dates and all of that. We're making splits right now, making nukes up, and we're very mindful of not leaving the mother colony too large. We don't want it to peak before the honey flow starts. It's as simple as that. There's a lot of tricks and techniques. You'll read about checkerboarding, and you'll read about this, and you'll read about that, and they all have merit. But as a commercial outfit, we have to approach it from a labor point of view. When we split a colony today, we may not get back there for 4 weeks. So we have to look way down the calendar and figure out how to make it peak at just the right time for us much later. Does that make sense? Are there any questions about that one fact, about peaking before or after the honey flow? It's very important.
When you say peak, what do you mean by peak?
Peak population. If a colony is going to peak out at 60,000 bees, we want that to happen about 10 days after the honey flow starts. If you can get a colony into the honey flow without swarming and without building swarm cells, and it's got plenty of room on it, more times than not, it'll just settle in and make honey and not swarm on you. But if it senses, they have an interesting sense of what's coming. Even when we don't see the buds and see the flowers coming, they know somehow that all of this is coming down the road. About 2 weeks out, you can just see the cups start to, the queen cups start to arrive on the bottoms of the combs, and a few days later you start to see eggs in them, and they want to swarm just before or right around the time that the major honey flow starts. That's their best odds of making it, so to speak. And they have a sense for all of this. But if they're depopulated to the point where they're just going to peak a little later than that, it really raises your odds for keeping them from swarming. And of course, empty equipment and empty drawn comb above the brood nest, all of that is very important too, but you just got to keep them from peaking too early. It's really important. Simple as that, really.
So if you take some of and split it up so that they've depopulated, and they had a few little queen cups or whatever, and you just slice those off?
Doesn't matter. Her question is, if you're working the colony and depopulating it, should you get rid of the queen cups? They'll be there tomorrow. You can take them all out, and tomorrow they'll all be back there. It's just, once they start to get them wet, once those cups have a wet appearance or begin to have brood food or royal jelly in them, even if there's not an egg in it, you know that the bees are right on the verge of starting to use those cells. First they build them, then they polish them. They're like a mirror inside, and then they start getting them wet, and then they start putting royal jelly in them. If you get to that point, you've got to do something drastic to turn the colony around and keep it from swarming. Best just to depopulate them early. Now is a good time. You guys are earlier than we are down here. We're up in the mountains. If I lived here, I would have been starting to split and equalize colonies 2 weeks ago. Equalizing can be a very important part of this too. When we're making nukes, like the way I'm going to describe to you in a few minutes, we try to equalize the smaller colonies also. If a colony is lagging behind and doesn't look like it's going to peak in time to make a honey crop, we'll take extra brood from the big colonies after we're done making the nuke. If there's any left, we'll slip it into the smaller colonies and build their population up. As commercial beekeepers, we want the whole yard to be the same. We want to be able to manipulate it in the same fashion at the same time. We don't want to put supers on half the colonies and come back 10 days later and do the rest. We want to bring the big ones up, or the small ones up and the big ones down, have them all be the same. So when we have to treat, feed, super, whatever, we're doing it all at the same time. Equalizing is a real good tool. Don't be afraid to do it. I know it's intimidating for new beekeepers, but we use sealed brood that would have the appearance that it's beginning to hatch. You know, you see a few bees chewing out. You can shake most of the bees off of a frame of brood like that and add it to a smaller colony. It's already generating its own heat, and it doesn't need all the bees to keep it warm when you give it to a smaller colony. When you shake most of the bees, or at least we shake about half off, then you can get a really good look, and we become, positive that the queen's not there. Then we're comfortable moving it over. If it's not sealed, you got to move bees with it. You need the extra bees to take care of the open brood. So sealed brood is the best. Sealed and or hatching is the best thing to equalize with. Yes, sir?
Is it possible to move the nurse bees to another hive without them being attacked?
Yes, his question is it possible to move the nurse bees to another colony without them being attacked? Nurse bees are fairly docile, and they're not going to be inclined to fight with a colony you give them to. If you're moving open brood, there'll be a high percentage of nurse bees on that comb. There's a lot of talk, there's a lot in the books about bees fighting when you move brood around. We do it constantly. We might move hundreds of combs every day and almost never see signs that there was a battle. We don't do anything fancy. We don't do anything. We'll just move brood at will, and it's very rare that we see any signs that the bees fought. Now, if you want to trick them a little bit, you can spray them with a little sugar water. By the time they're done licking each other off, they're all sisters. Yes, sir.
When you do your splits this time of year, are you putting mated queens with them, or you let them make their own queens?
We are right now, and we will be for the next couple weeks. It's too early for us to raise our own queens up there. We have a friend down in North Florida. His name's Chris Werner, and he owns Indian Summer Honey Farm in Webster, Florida. He's a Florida-Wisconsin beekeeper. He migrates back and forth, and he makes queens commercially every spring. And he's very nice and very generous to us. We send him our breeder queens, literally put them in the mail in December, and he's grafting and raising queens off of the stock that we give him. We try to push towards carniolan as much as we can. We have extremely expensive artificially inseminated carniolan breeder queens. I don't send him those. I don't send an $850 queen through the mail, but I'll give him their daughters. And we sent him 3 in December, and 1 didn't work out. He's using 2 of them right now, and the queens we're getting look just like ours. And he's a highly carniolan outfit too, so we're real happy with what they're mating with. And then in a few weeks, actually to be exact, I think it's the 19th that we are scheduled to start grafting our own cells. So we'll start putting our own cells. When you graft, it's about 11 or 12 days later that we put the cells in the mating nukes. So, and then another 2 weeks and the queens start laying. So it won't be that long, but up until that point, it's going to be his queens with our stock. So we don't try to trick anybody. We say, yeah, it's our stock, and we try to give them this little story so they understand that the earliest queens we're selling are not ours, but they're our bees.
More interested in, for my own stock, you know, when should I start being concerned about doing my splits and letting them make their own queens?
You want to see drones hatching.
Right.
The books will, his question is when should he be comfortable in making his own splits and letting them rear their own queens? Is that correct? You need to, I like to see, the books will tell you if you see the drone larvae have purple eyes, that they'll be mature in time. You want the drones to be at least 2 weeks, preferably 3 weeks old before they're mature enough to mate. If you see hatching drones literally in your colonies and you let them raise their own queen right then, it's going to be 3 weeks or so before she'll be out. 2.5 to 3 weeks she'll be out mating. So those drones will be right on time when that queen's ready to mate, in my view. And by the way, when you buy the very earliest queens from many queen producers, that's a mistake because they're pushing the envelope just as far as they can for getting mating. And they do that because the customers are demanding those earliest queens. When you get queens coming out of South Georgia on the 15th or the 18th of March, guess what? A lot of them, some years, not always, but some years you'll see a high rate of supersedure. You'll see a higher than average rate of queens go drone laying. The supersedure is because they didn't get mated properly. The bees have a sense of how well mated that queen is. She should be mating with 12 or 15 drones. If she only mates with 1 or 2 or 3, her pattern might be okay, but that's not ideal. And the bees sense that, and just in short order, 30 days later, here they are superseding their queen and making a new one. So resist the urge to get the very earliest queens out of South Georgia or anywhere else for that matter. Wait for the second round or maybe even the third round and you'll get better queens, less supersedure, better acceptance, just everything.
I'm trying to raise my own queens so they're local to the area here.
Yeah, I would wait till I see drones hatching and not just 2 or 3, maybe 2,000 or 3,000. You want a lot of drones in the air for good mating. There's all kinds of literature on how many colonies per queen's being mated, and I've heard as little as 6 colonies for 1,000 queens being mated. We don't approach it like that at all. We approach it like 2 or 3 well-stocked bee yards surrounding our mating yards. And I've noticed over the years that we get the very best mating when our drone population is within a mile or less of our virgin queens that are going out to mate. The books will tell you that queens will go 3, 4, 5, even 7 or 8 miles to mate, but they don't do that on purpose. They do that if they don't find what they need between here and there. Drones, we think, probably only fly a quarter mile in most instances, maybe a half. Occasionally they'll go a mile, but if you think about a drone, he's like a little airplane with a fuel tank. He can only go so far, and he has to make it back home. You're not going to see a drone from one location 3 miles out. He can't do it. And the queens don't go 3 or 4 or 5 miles out on purpose either. So you can kind of put this picture together where you need to put the queens and drones close together, but not necessarily in the same yard. They say that queens do go some distance in order to find drones that do not belong to them. Well, let's just take that information that we just threw out there and think about it. The drones go maybe a quarter, half mile, no more than a mile. Maybe the queens are going a half mile to a mile and a half. So you can kind of give you a picture of where your drone stock needs to be. Now, that having been said, we made a lot of queens occasionally with the drone source being in the same yard as the virgin queens, and we have good luck. But the very best results we've ever had are when the drone mother colonies are a half mile to a mile out. And we put a triangle around the mating yard.
Do you use drone cone to increase your drone?
We do, and I'll show you one in a minute. We use them in a big way. And for purposes, and just for that purpose, we don't use them for trapping mites. We use them for producing a zillion drones. We want a serious amount of drones in the air when we're mating queens. That's how we get the best results.
Thank you.
Okay, so we talked about equalization, swarm control. See, I told you, it wouldn't be the same. He's seen this, I think he's listened to this talk 2 or 3 times, and 5 times. Yeah, it's different every time. And I should also add that I just wrote an article for Bee Culture magazine. It came out in the March issue, if you haven't seen it. I'm paralleling that article, and the article is probably better because I have the advantage, if I don't like what I said, I can delete it and write it again. Here it's just kind of off the top of my head, and I leave things out and say things kind of cockeyed, but if you're really interested in everything you hear tonight, I would recommend looking up that article in Bee Culture. It has the same information, but probably better. Okay, I'll bring the equipment over and we'll talk about an interesting way of making nukes that some of you are probably not familiar with.